Our topic here today is race and ethnicity. By the way, the photo here is by photographer Martin Scholler, and it's from an exhibit called Changing Faces of America. It involves portraits of people who self-identify on the U.S. Census as multiracial. We'll start by situating the problem of racism within the context of two events that may not seem at first to be directly related. Then we'll deconstruct the concept of race, the myths, the science, and the social reality we are struggling with still today. We'll finish up by examining the latest rise in racism, both here in North America and in Europe. Exactly 1 year ago, hockey commentator Don Cherry lost his cool on the subject of people not buying poppies for Remembrance Day. The target of his anger was immigrants. Cherry's TV career itself self-destructed shortly thereafter, and I'll read the comment to you. "You people, you love our way of life. You love our milk and honey. At least you can pay a couple bucks for a poppy or something like that. These guys paid for your way of life that you enjoy in Canada. These guys paid the biggest price." Here's the response on social media by Jagmeet Singh, leader of the NDP party. And he starts by saying, "Don Cherry, let me introduce you to you people." And there's a photograph, as you can see here, of his great-grandfather who served both in World War I and in World War II. Okay, here's our second incident. Exactly 1 year earlier, Jamel Roberson was working as an armed security guard at a bar in Chicago. He asked a group of intoxicated men to leave the bar, but one of them returned and started shooting. Roberson fired back and then caught one of the men outside the bar. He had the suspect down on the ground at gunpoint when two white police officers arrived. Despite the fact that Jamel was wearing a uniform, a vest that said security, one of the officers shot and killed him. Just last month, the state attorney's office indicated that no criminal charges will be filed against the officer. So let's look at what the Don Cherry story and the Jamel Roberson story have in common. First, both involve what I'm going to call othering, an individual or a group being treated as a single category and acted upon according to predetermined ideas. In the case of Don Cherry, it's you immigrants versus we white Canadians. In the case of Jamel Roberson, it's the way that the police officer assumed that any black man with a weapon is an automatic risk. We'll come back to this idea of the other in this week's tutorial. For now, let's unpack some common sense ideas about race that are just underneath the surface of the two incidents, the Don Cherry incident and Jamel Roberson. First, the idea that racial categories refer to meaningful biological differences between people. Second, the idea that these biological differences can be linked to different behaviors and abilities. From a scientific perspective, there are lots of problems with these views of race. First of all, there's the science. If we look at physical differences like skin color, they represent a minuscule amount of our genetic makeup, and it's actually about 0.24% of our genetic makeup. Secondly, scientists proved a long time ago that there aren't meaningful distinctions between races based on genetics. The other myth that tends to go along with common sense views about race concerns athletic superiority. And it's usually supported with selected statistics from a handful of sports, as you're seeing here, from basketball, from football, track and field. What that doesn't get around is the fact that there is no gene for athletic superiority and no genetic links between athletic abilities, and particular races have been found. The fact is that black athletes are almost invisible in many sports, such as hockey or pro baseball and many others. By the way, the chart on this page looks at non-white participation in golf. What sociologists have shown us is that it is social conditions rather than race that lead to high participation in sports, a story that is vividly told in Chapter 10 of our textbook. Another set of racial mythologies has to do with intelligence. In the US, low IQ scores by some immigrant groups roughly in the 1920s were used as a rationale to restrict immigration from those groups. What we now know is that IQ scores go up when people have better educational opportunities and when they move up the social ladder. And by the way, IQ scores also go down when people are under stress. All of which leads us to how sociologists understand race. For sociologists, race refers to how people are socially distinguished based on physical markers such as skin color or perhaps the shape of their eyes. Sociologists recognize that people who look different are treated differently. We understand that there is no biological basis for racially based ideas. So, let's talk about race as a social reality. And let's start with what sociologists call the Thomas theorem. If people define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. So if people believe, like Don Cherry, that immigrants are ungrateful, or, like the police who shot Jamel Roberson, that young black men are inherently dangerous, it matters, because people act on those beliefs. As we look around our world in 2020, we see that racism is not fading away, but in fact it's on the rise in many places. We can see the rise of what we politely call ethnic nationalism in Europe. 3 years ago in Poland, about 60,000 protesters on the streets were marching and calling for a white Europe and clean blood. And by the way, that's the image in the top right corner. And in the USA, we are seeing the rise of white supremacism energized by the right-wing populism of people like Donald Trump. Thanks for listening in.